This is literally 1,000 starships, as depicted by SpaceX Vision, who I have linked in the description. But although obviously 1,000 starships would not be spaced out like this so close, but just look at the vastness of what a fleet like this actually is. It's just unending. So as most of us know, this is what Elon plans to use to get 1 million colonists to the Martian surface by 2050, which in my opinion is absolutely impossible. Even assuming that you could get 100 colonists onto each one of these, you're still only looking at 100,000 people per transition. And then you need at least 2 starships per passenger starship in order to carry the necessary infrastructure. So you're looking at a lot of journeys. But for the moment, let's assume that it could be done, that we started out earlier, that the starship was created earlier, and that we were already in this process, and getting 1 million people to the red planet was actually possible. Would they survive? Well, there's a lot of people who say no, and they have some very compelling arguments, or at least they appear to. And sometimes their arguments are just plain stupid, such as an article that's entitled "We Will Never Colonize Mars" that wastes an entire paragraph saying things like this: "The red planet is a cold, dead place with an atmosphere about 100 times thinner than Earth's. You may as well be exposed to the vacuum of space, resulting in a severe form of the bends, including ruptured lungs, dangerously swollen skin and body tissue, and ultimately, death, 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 death." So after wasting all that time talking about the consequences of stepping foot on the red planet without a spacesuit, as if somebody would be stupid enough to do that, the article gets around to talking about useful things, such as the gravity, which is, understandably, a serious concern. Quote, "Gravity on the red planet is 0.375 that of Earth's, which means a 180-pound person on Earth would weigh a scant 68 pounds on Mars. While that might sound appealing, this low-gravity environment would likely wreak havoc to human health in the long term and possibly have negative impacts on human fertility." The article continues to claim that the concept of a large colony on Mars is, quote, "literally science fiction," and that the notion that we'll soon set up colonies inhabited by hundreds or thousands of people is pure nonsense, with an unmitigated denial of the tremendous challenges posed by such a prospect, end quote. Unfortunately, the article fails to point out any solid scientific data to support this, because we don't have any. The article goes on to point out the dangers of radiation, they love that one, and also the challenges of living in a sterilized environment as people do on the ISS, deprived of the very bacteria that keeps our immune systems healthy, and so future Martians would be incredibly vulnerable to diseases brought by future Earthlings. And it gets even worse than that. Quote, "Life in a Martian colony would be miserable, with people forced to live in artificially lit underground bases. Life in this closed environment with limited access to the surface could result in other health issues related to exclusive indoor living, such as depression, boredom from lack of stimulus, an inability to concentrate, poor eyesight, high blood pressure, and a complete disconnect from nature." Man, that sounds horrifying. It's also complete horseshit. There is no scientific data to thoroughly support this notion. None at all, because humans have never lived in this environment before, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that living on Mars would be nothing like what's being depicted here. As a matter of fact, we need to assume that we could survive, and there are many reasons to believe that we would. And if we do, what kind of humans are we ultimately going to become as the generations pass and evolution takes Martians on an entirely different track? Well, that is what this video is going to be covering in just a few minutes. Good evening, and welcome to yet another episode of the Angry Astronaut, my final episode that I will be recording here during my stay in Boca Chica. I am still extremely angry because I've been doing a fair amount of research since To the Future had released their last video about the future of Martian colonization, what we can expect when the human race occupies Mars. Yes, and I picked this up actually in Houston, but and like it, nice T-shirt, highly recommended. Anyway, but there's a general consensus amongst a lot of the scientific community that occupying or colonizing Mars is simply impossible. That the human race is never going to be able to do this, that the conditions there are too harsh, and the combination of radiation and 1/3 gravity are going to make it simply impossible for us to be able to survive in the long term, combined with many other things, such as the fact that we tend to travel in sterilized environments like on the ISS, devoid of microbial life. And if that is the case, if that's what we bring with us to Mars, then we're going to have depleted systems, unexposed to bacteria, unexposed to disease, and therefore our immune systems are going to be shot, and we're just going to die of disease, or we're going to die because we can't adapt to 1/3 gravity, or pregnancies aren't going to be viable. Children will never be born because of 1/3 gravity, or they'll be mutated because of radiation. All of these nightmare scenarios. And I'm here to tell you that all of these claims are completely unscientific. As a matter of fact, they're thorough bullshit. And I love to say this word more than once. Bullshit. And I'm going to tell you why. For one thing, the most important thing is the fact that we don't know what any of these factors are going to do to the human body. We've seen what microgravity does to the human body. We have yet to see what 1/3 gravity does. And we have seen what long-term exposure to Martian level radiation does to the human body, because the astronauts on the ISS experience it every day. The whole idea that the surface of Mars is bathed in deadly radiation day in and day out that will kill somebody after being exposed for a few days, a few weeks, all of that is nonsense, and I have talked about that extensively in other videos. That's not what I'm going to talk about. Instead, what I want to discuss is what is likely to happen to the human species, what is likely to happen to human beings who go to Mars, successfully have children, and the ways that they will be able to do this and survive, and what kind of new human being is going to result. There will be changes, no doubt, and we can find examples of what kind of changes are likely to occur right here on Earth. What the hell am I talking about? Well, let's find out right now. All right, I've done this before, but let's get this radiation garbage out of the way again real quick. This is a map of the radiation levels that one can expect on Mars in annual amounts absorbed over the course of one's lifetime. The middle of the scale is about 14 to 15 rems per year, and the annual amount recommended by NASA for a 25-year-old female is 100 rems. So let's take that very young woman and put her right here for 5 years, 24 hours a day on the Martian surface with just a spacesuit. She still would not accumulate enough radiation to exceed NASA's recommended limit in that 5-year period. And that's assuming she was stupid enough to stay on the surface for 5 solid years, 24 hours a day. That's not going to happen. So what is likely to happen is an adjustment in the amount of melanin that Martians have in their skin. Exposure to radiation, and especially ultraviolet light, is going to start creating changes in skin tone over the generations. Now, this may come in the form of darker skin or perhaps orangish skin, depending on the results. Once again, we can't say for certain because we haven't done it yet. And by the way, why orange? Well, because the carotene in somebody's system, the stuff that we get from carrots, actually increases our resistance to radiation. Yup, if you eat lots of carrots, you gain resistance to radioactivity and you start to turn orange. Now, not complete resistance, of course, but it does help. So an increased amount of carotene in our system is a logical evolutionary conclusion. And this is one thing to keep in mind when people start talking about the impossibility of human beings being able to adapt to living on Mars. The human capacity to adapt is incredible. For example, in an article entitled High Altitude and Cancer Mortality, quote, "Humans living at high altitude are exposed to chronic hypoxia. Despite the permanent stress of hypoxic exposure, humans populating high-altitude areas have reduced cancer mortality over a broad spectrum of cancer types," unquote. So much so that doctors are looking into high-altitude living as a treatment for cancer. How is this possible when people living at high altitude are exposed to more ultraviolet light and radiation? And nowhere else in the world is the human ability to adapt more obvious than amongst the people of Tibet. Researchers discovered in 2010 that Tibetans have several genes that allow them to use smaller amounts of oxygen efficiently, allowing them to deliver enough of it to their limbs while exercising at high altitude. For decades and decades, scientists were mystified as to how Tibetans were able to function and actually work extremely hard at altitudes above 4,000 meters, where most humans get ill. Well, it's because they adapted to the new environment and adapted very quickly. And this phenomenon is by no means unique to the people of Tibet. The people of the Andes have an entirely different adaptation that allows them to work at high altitude. Their bodies add more oxygen-carrying hemoglobin to their blood. Now, they didn't just decide to do this, it happened as a result of evolution and adaptation, a very natural process that affects all human beings. And if it happens here, it's going to happen on Mars. So what about the 1/3 gravity? Well, some scientists paint a very bleak picture, saying that our skeletal structures will get weaker and therefore we will shrink and our skull sizes will shrink as well, which means that our lifespan will decrease. And we'll end up starting to look a little bit more like this guy. Smaller, a weak skeletal structure, big eyes because of the living on Mars in a low-light environment. In other words, a lot likelier to die, a lot easier to break your bones, that sort of thing. Does that sound like natural selection to you? No, not to me either. What other scientists have theorized, and what I find to be far more likely, is that the human body will compensate, becoming actually more resilient and actually larger over time to make up for the bone loss and muscle loss. This will probably be enhanced by the fact that Martians will have a daily routine of exercise that they will have carried over from the time that they spent arriving on Mars in the first place. Exercising on Mars and staying healthy is going to be a key factor in their survival. which is one of many things that are going to distinguish Martian humans from everybody else. But what about the sterilized environment that's going to leave our system completely compromised as far as immunity is concerned? Well, the solution to that is pretty damn simple as well. Don't make our Martian habitats sterile. Instead, bring the bacteria that keeps our immune system solid and highly resistant to disease along with us. The bacteria in our guts that help us digest, that's already going to be there anyway. And there are other ways to bring bacteria as well. And yes, you may think I've gone nuts, but I am dead serious. Bring our pets along with us, or some other form of mammal, if not a dog. Dogs have already been to space and survived, along with monkeys and other animals. Why not a dog and all the bacteria that they will carry with them, or a large enough number of dogs to start a breeding population? As impractical as this may sound, just a small number of animals to begin with could create a sizable population on Mars. Now, it would be extremely traumatic for the poor animals during things like takeoff. They would probably have to be sedated during that process, and microgravity would be a very difficult experience as well. But 1/3 gravity? I would say that a dog could adapt to that as well as we could. Now, of course, there would be other drawbacks for dogs. For example, they use their sense of smell an awful lot, and locking a dog inside a spacesuit would be akin to torture, unless you could let the smells of the Martian environment in somehow. I would be very interested in a proof of concept filter that would allow a small amount of the Martian atmosphere into a spacesuit. Remember, it's almost all CO2, and we can handle several hundred parts per million. Can you imagine the usefulness of a dog that's been trained to seek out, say, brine or other types of saltwater ice that's likely to be just beneath the surface on Mars? They would probably be very good at detecting it in the same way that they can detect buried human beings after a disaster. And not only that, they would bring the companionship of a pet along to the red planet and all of the bacteria that would be necessary to keep us safe and healthy in the generations to come. No, we don't have to be a weak and vulnerable species if we decide to become Martian colonists. Anything but if we just simply think outside the box, as I often encourage people to do on this channel. But wait just a second. What about the prospect of contaminating Mars with our bacteria? Isn't that going to be a crime if there's life already there? Well, here's what I believe about that. Martian bacteria, if they do indeed exist, which I think they do, are going to be able to survive anything we can throw at them with ease, given what they've been able to survive already. Not just the carbon dioxide and the extreme temperatures, but also the presence of perchlorates. Perchlorates can kill just about any form of Earth bacteria, with very few exceptions, in a very short order. So any Martian bacteria that has been able to survive these perchlorates would be able to have a leg up on any Earth bacteria trying to compete with them. I would say that Martian life would actually be a greater threat to us than the other way around. But now we come to perhaps the most challenging and controversial issue of Mars colonization: 1/3 gravity and the development of the human fetus, and whether or not fertilization can even take place. Well, as far as fertilization is concerned, this seems to be no problem. We've been able to artificially inseminate mice in microgravity situations, and fertilization takes place as normal. It seems that life finds a way. But the development of the fetus, it may get confused in 1/3 gravity, push hard against a woman's diaphragm, making it difficult for her to breathe. And also, it may not do a number of very important developmental things, such as drop at week 39. Now, there is, of course, a couple of extreme solutions to this. First of all, to provide artificial oxygen to the mother should it become necessary during the early stages of pregnancy, and then to deliver the baby at week 39 should this happen, at least until human beings adapt to the 1/3 gravity conditions. Now, premature babies oftentimes survive at week 24. Week 39 should not be a problem. However, what happens to children afterwards is anybody's guess. Now, as I'm about to say in my closing remarks, we should do extensive animal experimentation before we even consider reproduction on Mars and raising children there. However, given the fact that Tibetan children are able to grow up in an atmosphere that's zero point 0.6 as dense as the vast majority of humans live in, and they do just fine, leads me to believe that children born on Mars are going to be able to adapt to Mars as easily as we do to new environments here. Now, does this mean that they'll be able to visit Earth? Probably not. But at the same time, they will have so many other opportunities available to them. For example, Martians are going to have a far easier time colonizing places like Titan than humans on Earth will be able to, simply because of the gravitational issues. Titan has a gravity that's similar to that of our moon, therefore a little less than 50% that of Mars, a much easier environment for a Martian to adapt to than a human born on Earth. Therefore, I foresee that Martians are going to become children of the solar system, far better suited to explore this home system of ours, this solar system that birthed our species, than people on Earth. What a strange and ironic situation. So what do I foresee future Martians as being like? Orangish-skinned or perhaps dark-skinned human beings, perhaps with eyes better adapted to pink skies and blue sunsets and a dark planet, but otherwise unquestionably human and better suited to explore the solar system than we are. A species full of adventure and full of an ability to survive, an exciting future, not a bleak one. Now, look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the people, the very intelligent and well educated people who have said that colonizing Mars is an impossibility for this huge list of reasons, are completely full of it. Okay. There is a possibility that they're right about a few things. I think that they are wrong about the radiation issues. I think that that is something that is easily dealt with. And as far as the things that they love to talk about the hostile nature of the Martian environment, well, we're going to compensate for that with life support, just like we do on the ISS. That's absurd. And we've been living on the ISS now for over 2 decades as a species. And thus far, yeah, the impacts of microgravity are significant. The long-term effects of radiation, haven't really seen much of it. As a matter of fact, there is no higher incidence of cancer amongst astronauts than there is amongst the general population. I'll say that again. No higher incidence of cancer amongst astronauts than the general population. And this includes astronauts who have been out in space for more than 2 years of their life, exposed to the radiation of the ISS, which once again is similar to that of Mars, for over 2 years without any significant ill effects. It's not radiation. Now, radiation may change, as I said in the video, how we appear. We may develop greater amounts of melanin. We may have a different skin tone than Earthlings do, and also the low light of the planet may change us. But as far as, the viability of pregnancy, again, as I said in the video, the whole notion of the fetus not dropping, at least to begin with, that can be taken care of with today's technology. Premature fetuses, as I said in the video, are perfectly viable 10 weeks prior to that point, if we had to go there, if we had to get that desperate. And deliver a child premature at that stage, well over 30 weeks of development, yeah, it wouldn't be ideal, but if that's what's necessary, we can do it with today's technology. There's no, we're not there yet as far as that's concerned. Now, there could be other things that we don't know about, other things that one-third gravity and the other aspects of living on Mars that will make it impossible, that humans will simply be unable to adapt to. I tend to think that that also is untrue, given the examples of the Tibetans and the people who live in the Andes that I gave to you during the video. Look how quickly those people adapted to very harsh and very different conditions than existed at sea level. It's not something that took millions of years, but thousands. And it's not like these people gradually moved up the side of the mountains bit by bit as their bodies were able to adapt. They just went there and dealt with it, just as we're going to have to. But still, I will acknowledge that it is possible that we will never be able to adapt to the radical changes gravity-wise that Mars is going to represent. And if that is indeed the case, then we are doomed as a species. We will be forever restricted to our own planet, and eventually some planet-wide cataclysm will wipe us out and render us extinct. We cannot survive as a single planet civilization. It's simply impossible. One day, one way or the other, something will take us out. And that's a very sad future. Far more sad than the prospect of living on Mars or someplace else in the solar system. And I say, until we know that for certain, we don't give up. We experiment, of course, first on animals. Rhesus monkeys, they're always the poor guys who get to be exposed the first time to harsh conditions and new vaccines. Those poor little guys, I feel sorry for them on a regular basis, actually. But until we know that for certain, we don't give up. Period. If you like the way I say things, if you like my opinions, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. I have enjoyed this 4-part series that I've done with To the Future. It has been my honor to collaborate with them. So until we are on Mars and experiencing the harsh conditions of this wonderfully alien planet that holds as many magnificent wonders for our species as it holds harsh realities as well. And until we know for certain, one way or another, as to whether or not we truly can be a multiplanetary species, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.